The whole town saw the levee go up and figured Frank Calder had finally lost his mind. That was the summer of 2019, when the heat sat on the Millhaven Valley like something alive, and the Sycamore River ran so low you could walk across it in boots without soaking your ankles. Nobody was thinking about floods. Nobody was thinking about water at all, except to complain there wasn't enough of it. But Frank was out there every morning before 6, measuring the grade of his land with a surveyor's rod he'd bought secondhand from a civil engineer in Baton Rouge. He had a yellow legal pad full of calculations. He had topographic maps spread across his kitchen table, held flat at the corners by coffee mugs. He had 30 years of flood records going back to 1989, photocopied from the county clerk's office and organized by month in a 3-ring binder that his neighbor Pete Haller once picked up, flipped through, and set back down without a word. Pete didn't say anything to Frank that day, but the next morning at the feed store, he told everybody else. "Frank Calder's building some kind of wall around his property," he said, loud enough for the whole row of men at the counter to hear. "Got maps and charts, and God knows what else. Man's been watching too much Weather Channel." There was laughter. Not mean laughter, exactly. The kind that comes from people who've known someone a long time and have decided who that person is, and anything that doesn't fit that picture gets smoothed out into a joke. Frank was 63 years old. He'd come back from 22 years in the army with a bad knee, a hearing aid in his left ear, and a German shepherd named Drifter, who went everywhere he went. He'd bought the 12-acre parcel east of town with his separation pay and a small inheritance from his mother, built a house on it mostly by himself over the course of 2 years, and lived there quietly ever since. He kept to himself without being unfriendly. He waved at people. He brought food to the church pantry twice a month. He just didn't explain himself much, and in a town like Millhaven, in a county where people had been farming the same land for 4 generations, that kind of quiet got interpreted as strange. What nobody knew, because Frank didn't talk about it, was that before he'd bought that particular parcel, he'd spent 8 months studying it. He'd researched the hydrology of the Sycamore watershed going back to the 1920s. He knew the river had flooded this valley 3 times in the past century, each time worse than the last. Each time after a period of drought had hardened the soil and reduced absorption. He knew the county had deferred maintenance on the upstream retention infrastructure for 11 years running due to budget shortfalls. He knew that the National Weather Service's long-range models showed an increasing probability of extreme precipitation events in the region through the 2020s. He knew all of this because in the Army, Frank had been a combat engineer. For more than 2 decades, he had built bridges under fire, demolished compromised structures in hostile territory, and assessed the integrity of fortifications that men's lives depended on. He had learned in the most serious school there is that the time to prepare is always before you need to. So when he built his house, he built it on a poured concrete foundation, elevated 4 feet above the surrounding grade. He installed water barriers along the property's eastern edge. He planted a berm of dense root-stabilizing grasses along the flood corridor. He put in a backup generator, a 6-month food supply, a hand pump well, and a first aid kit that a combat medic would have been comfortable using. None of this was visible from the road. What was visible was the levee, a low earthen wall, maybe 3.5 feet high, that curved along the northern and western boundaries of his property. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even that tall. But it was there, in a valley where nobody had thought anything like that was necessary, and that was enough to make people talk. "He thinks the apocalypse is coming," said Connie Marsh at the hair salon, and that became the version that circulated. Even Drifter got pulled into it. People would see the big shepherd patrolling the yard at dawn, nose working along the fence line, and somebody started saying Frank had trained the dog to guard against neighbors. That wasn't true either. Drifter was just a dog who liked mornings and took his job seriously. Frank heard the talk. In a town of 2,400 people, You always hear the talk. He didn't defend himself. He'd learned long ago that the gap between what you say and what people decide to hear is wider than most people imagine. And the best argument is always the thing that actually happens. He just kept working. The summer turned into fall, and fall into the driest winter Millhaven had seen in 40 years. The sycamore dropped to a trickle. The soil cracked. Farmers who'd been out here 3 generations said they'd never seen it like this. And then, in the second week of March, the weather broke. It didn't break gently. A slow-moving system came up from the Gulf, stalled over the Tennessee Valley, and sat there for 4 days, pulling moisture from the south and dumping it in sheets across the watershed. 3 inches the first night, 2 the second. Another 1.5 inches before dawn on the 3rd day. The frozen ground, rock-hard from the drought, couldn't absorb any of it. The hardpan just sheeted it downhill, into the creeks, into the tributaries, into the Sycamore. Frank had been watching the forecast for 11 days. On day 7, he'd begun final preparations. He sealed his door thresholds with the flexible barriers he'd built from aluminum channel and rubber gasket material. He moved his vehicles to high ground. He charged every battery on the property, filled every container with clean water, and double-checked his food stores. On the evening of day 9, with the rain already falling steadily, he sat in his kitchen with Drifter at his feet and a cup of coffee going cold on the table, watching the river gauge on his laptop tick upward degree by degree. At 11:42 on the Sycamore River crested at 28.4 feet. Flood stage was 14. The levee on the north side of town, the one the county had been meaning to reinforce for 6 years, gave way at 12:08 in the morning. Frank heard it, not the structure failing exactly, but the change in sound that comes when something that was holding back suddenly stops holding. A low, deep percussion, like a door slamming in a very large room. He put on his rain gear, looked at Drifter and said, "Let's go." By the time he got to his fence line, the water was already moving across the lower fields to the north, silver and fast in the beam of his headlamp. It was cold. He could see it spreading, finding the low ground, taking the path of least resistance, the way water always does. He stood there for a moment, watching the direction it was moving. Then he got in his truck and drove toward town. The water had come in from the north end of Main Street and was running shin-deep through the lower block by the time he got there. The power was out. The only lights were headlights and phone screens. And, in a few windows, the weak flicker of candles. People were standing in doorways, or wading through the current with bags and boxes, or just standing still in the middle of the street looking stunned. Frank had pulled his truck as high as it would go and was moving on foot. He'd brought rope, a first aid kit, a hand-cranked radio, and 3 emergency blankets in a pack on his back. Drifter moved beside him in the dark, ears forward, reading the situation the way the dog always did, carefully, with a seriousness that Frank had always thought was unusual in an animal. The first person he found was old Clarence Webb, 81 years old, standing on his front porch with the water at the second step. Clarence had lived in that house for 50 years. He wasn't leaving. "Clarence," Frank said. "It's going to get higher." "I know that," Clarence said. "Then, let's get you out." It took 10 minutes of patient conversation and one look at Drifter, who had put his head gently against the old man's hip in a way that apparently communicated something Frank couldn't, before Clarence finally agreed to come. Frank walked him out through the current, one hand under his arm, Drifter moving on Clarence's other side, like a furry wall between the old man and anything the water might carry. He got Clarence to the community center on the hill, which still had power, and whose director, a woman named Sandra, had already opened it up and was running an extension cord to a space heater. Frank brought Clarence in, made sure he was sitting down, and went back out. Over the next 3 hours, he made 6 more trips. He found a young mother named Claire with 2 kids under 5, standing on her kitchen table with the water at her knees, her phone dead, no way to call for help. He waded in through her side door, got the kids onto his back one at a time, and got them out. He found 2 elderly brothers, Dennis and Cal, who'd been in Millhaven their whole lives and had never owned a cell phone between them. They were on their second floor, sitting in the dark, listening to the water move through their living room below. And then Drifter found the boy. Frank had been working his way back through the lower block when the dog stopped. Not the slow, investigative stop of a dog that smells something interesting. The rigid, full-body stop of a dog that knows something. Frank stopped too. Drifter turned off the main current, pushing through hip-deep water toward the old warehouse on Clement Street, the one that had been empty since the paper mill closed. Frank followed, the water pulling at his thighs. Drifter moved fast now, certain, and Frank had learned over 8 years together to trust that certainty completely. They found the boy in a gap between the loading dock and the back wall. 12 years old, as it turned out, named Tyler, who had been out past curfew at a friend's house when the flood hit and tried to shortcut home through the alley. The water had caught him and carried him into the warehouse foundation, and he'd grabbed the loading dock edge and held on. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip. Frank got to him, got an arm around him, and for a moment they just stayed like that, the boy holding on, Frank holding the boy. Drifter pressed against them both, the current pushing and the rain still coming down. "I got you," Frank said. "You're okay." It wasn't a dramatic thing to say. He wasn't trying to be heroic. It was just the true thing, and so he said it. Getting back out was hard. The current was stronger now, and Tyler was dead weight, his legs not working the way he needed them to. Frank moved them along the wall, hand by hand, finding footholds in the dark, with Drifter breaking the current on the upstream side. A 70-pound shepherd against moving water, doing what he could. 20 feet from the end of the alley, Drifter went under. Not for long. The dog came up immediately, shook his head, kept moving. But Frank saw it, and he felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. They got out. Frank got Tyler to the community center, handed him to Sandra, watched him wrapped in blankets. He turned around to go back out, and Drifter was limping. He knelt down in the light of the community center doorway and ran his hands down the dog's right front leg. Something in the lower joint, whether it was from being pulled by the current or hitting something in the water, Frank couldn't tell. Drifter stood still and let Frank examine him, patient, looking up at his face the whole time. "You're done for tonight," Frank told him. Drifter lay down in the community center entryway and didn't argue. Frank went back out alone. He didn't find anyone else. By 4 in the morning, the rain had finally eased, and the water had peaked and was beginning, slowly, to recede. Frank came back to the community center and sat down on the floor next to Drifter and didn't move for a while. There were 43 people in the community center by morning. The flood had done significant damage. 18 homes destroyed or made uninhabitable. Most of the lower commercial district, the road infrastructure along the river corridor. It would take years to repair. Some things would not be repaired. But nobody in Millhaven had died. In the days that followed, as the water pulled back and people began the hard work of assessing the damage and figuring out how to go forward, something shifted in the way people talked about Frank Calder. It shifted the way these things do, not all at once, not with any announcement, but in small moments that accumulated into something different. Pete Haller came by 3 days after the flood, with a case of water and a handshake that lasted longer than a handshake usually does. Connie Marsh brought a covered dish. The Webb family, Clarence's daughter and 2 granddaughters, left a card in Frank's mailbox that he read twice before he put it away. What people said to each other was different from what any of them said to Frank directly. They said, he knew. They said, he'd been trying to tell us, in his way. They said, we should have listened. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the flood, Frank was at the hardware store picking up materials to help repair a neighbor's porch. He was in the lumber aisle, Drifter moving slowly beside him on the bad leg. The vet said it would heal, just needed time, when a man named Don Sherrill stopped him. Don was around 50, had a farm on the west side of the valley. had been one of the louder voices at the feed store 2 summers ago. He looked at Frank for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I was wrong about you." That was all. He didn't elaborate, didn't make a speech, didn't perform any particular emotion about it. He said it the way a man says something he means, and then he moved on down the aisle. Frank stood there for a moment. Drifter looked up at him. He thought about what to say to that, and decided there wasn't much to say. Don had said the real thing. That was enough. That evening, Frank drove out to the eastern edge of his property, where the levee had held through 4 nights of serious water. He walked along the top of it, the ground still soft beneath him, and looked out over the valley. The river was back within its banks. The fields were brown and wrecked. But in a few of them, at the edges, you could already see the beginning of green coming back. Drifter walked beside him, still favoring the right leg but refusing to stay home. The dog had always been like that. You couldn't keep him away from wherever Frank was going. That was the thing about certain dogs Frank had found. They don't require a reason to stay with you. They just do. He stopped at the northern corner of the levee, the point where his property met the old right-of-way, and stood looking out for a while. Down below, in the town, lights were coming on in windows. Somebody had power back on the lower block. He could see the orange glow of a porch light that he'd noticed had been dark for 2 weeks. He hadn't built this levee to be right about something. He hadn't built it to prove a point, or to earn an apology, or to have anyone look at him differently. He'd built it because the numbers said it was necessary, and because he understood, as anyone understands, who has served in a place where things can go very wrong very fast, that the time between when you know something and when you need to know it is always shorter than you expect. The people in Millhaven were good people. They'd been wrong about him, and most of them knew it now, and he wasn't interested in holding that against them. You can spend your life being angry at people for not seeing what you see, or you can just do the work and be there when it matters. He'd made his choice a long time ago. Drifter pressed against his leg in the dark, warm and solid, and Frank reached down and put his hand on the dog's head. The valley was quiet now. The river moved below them, steady and low again, carrying its brown water south toward the Gulf. The night was clear for the first time in weeks, and overhead, past the dark tree line, the stars were out. Frank stayed there a little while longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and Drifter walked with him, and the lights of Millhaven glowed soft behind them in the valley.